Before we get into chapter 8, I got one more thing to throw onto the arthropods, because if you're a biologist, it's kind of annoying. And I'm sure the guy who does these cartoons, since he's got some biology training, knew that it isn't true, but it makes for a nice joke. It says, the last thing a fly ever sees. A lot of arthropods, instead of having a single lens eye, have a bunch of lenses. And behind each lens is a little set of receptors. Now we have a single lens, and behind that is a screen of receptors. And our brains take the individual input from each one of those cells and makes a picture out of it. An insect or a crustacean takes the little bit of a picture from each one of these lenses and makes a picture out of it. It loses a bit of resolution because there are edges that don't have receptors to them, although there's tricks around that they use. But this is called a compound eye. And the disadvantage to a single lens eye is that you have the lens and you have the screen, you need some distance in between to throw a picture on the screen. Is that the bigger the lens, the farther the distance you have to get to. And if you're a very small animal without a lot of room in your head, that may not be the best use of space. Whereas a whole bunch of lenses can have a very short, what they call focal distance, and you can coat the whole outside of the head with it and not use up a lot of the real estate inside. On top of that, you can point lenses in all directions. It's really hard to sneak up on a fly because they have lenses pointing behind them and down and forward and sideways. So they're pretty much covered in every direction. Is that if you want to kill a fly, the easiest way to do it is to come at it from two directions at once, which tends to just make it take off. It doesn't know what direction to fly in and makes it a little bit easier. You can actually come over a fly and do that right above it. And the air coming out from it tends to fly straight up into the air coming out of your hands, and that often will kill it. Anyway, there are exceptions in arthropods. Not arthropods have compound eyes. Jumping spiders, which we get around here, little bitty guys, sometimes not so little bitty, very often black and white. And they have 4 good sized lenses on the front of their head, but their head is built so that there's a space behind it for the distance from there to the screen. So they actually have committed basically the whole top of their head to probably a higher resolution system. Also, if you're not freaked out by spiders, jumping spiders are fascinating. They are one of the few tiny animals that I found that when you look at it and it looks back at you, you get the feeling that it's sizing you up, that there's stuff going on in its little head. And they're capable of doing some fairly amazing things, just individual jumping spiders. Like being on a plant over here and seeing a potential prey animal moving on a plant over there and being able to go down to the ground and up that plant to right where that animal was. If you were in a building and looked across at the building across the street and saw somebody in an office that you wanted to talk to, your ability to find that office would be pretty limited. And you'd have to do a bunch of math and probably make some guesses. Whereas the spider has the ability to do that kind of processing. Okay, now we're done with the arthropods. Now we're going on to the echinoderms. This is the classic, typical echinoderm. Starfish. There's a bunch of other things in this group, but starfish is what people tend to think of when they think of an echinoderm. And the 2 major branches of living things, where you've got the arthropods and the mollusks and the annelids and stuff on one branch, those are the protostomes. We're now going up the deuterostome branch. This is the only other major group that's on the deuterostome branch with us. And there's a couple of features that echinoderms have that make them pretty bizarre. This is the least of the things. Sorry. sometimes I sort through trying to find what I want rather than just grabbing what I have next. These guys are pentaradially symmetrical, which means radial, it's a round body plan. Penta, it's a round body plan where the pie slices are sliceable by fifths. Where if you take a fifth of a pie slice of one of these animals and measure it to a fifth of another pie slice, more or less all the same stuff is going to be in there, right? Radial symmetry. So, and that's, you know, we saw that in Nidaria. There's some other minor phyla which have these kind of round setups, but this is somewhat unusual, and it's going to be more unusual in a second. As embryos, their first level of development is bilateral, two-sided. They change to pentaradial during their embryological development. And for sea cucumbers, which tend to be long and work their way through the sediments, so they have a front end and a back end, is that they are kind of bilateral, fully formed. So they go bilateral, pentaradial, bilateral again as they develop. It gets weird. Here's another odd feature. Back to this. They do have muscles, but a lot of the power that they generate is hydraulic, is through a pressurized fluid-filled system of tubes that they can generate a tremendous amount of power with. These blue lines in this starfish are water vascular tubes. There's a ring canal around the middle, radial canals. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this. This is the underside of a starfish. And there are these yellow things with little suction cups on the end. They look like little cylinders with suction cups on the end. They're called tube feet because they have tubes. Now, there's a little muscle that makes the suction cup work, but the feet extend and retract because on the top of them, there's like a little squeeze bulb. And the water vascular system squeezes and forces fluid down and extends or retracts the tube feet. And they can generate a tremendous amount of power with that. Starfish, weirdly enough, because they're very slow, are predators. They just are predators on things that are even slower than they are. A lot of them will eat like clams and oysters and other types of non-moving mussels. Some of them eat coral. And I'll give you a typical example of how this works. You give a clam to a starfish. It kind of, okay, here's the clam. It kind of goes up to it this way. This would be the open part of the clam. It gets on there and it hangs on. And after a while, sometimes hours, you see the clam open up. And when it opens up, the starfish consumes it. They used to think that it was a matter of tiring out, that the water vascular system didn't tire out the way that the clam muscle, the muscle it's using to hold its shell shut, that all these tube feet are pulling against, just tired out and couldn't hold out. Somebody did eventually discover that's not what's happening at all. The starfish attaches to the clamshell with hundreds and hundreds of tube feet and retracts them and opens the shell a little bit. So much so you wouldn't, as a researcher, you wouldn't even notice that the shell had been slightly opened. But there's the mouth. It turns out that a starfish has an extrudable stomach, and it would open the shell and stick its stomach inside the clam, inside the cavity, the mantle cavity of the clam, And instead of wrestling with it, it was digesting it. And eventually it would digest it to the point where the clam was dead, and then the muscle would totally relax and the shell would open up. But by then, a lot of the work had been done, and a lot of nutrients had already been absorbed into this extruded stomach that the starfish have. Something like sea cucumbers will actually spit their stomachs out as a defense mechanism. Something comes at them, they're not very fast, and it goes, here, eat this, I'm going this way. Some starfish will do a similar thing where they'll shake off one of their arms and go, here's something to keep you busy while I get out of here, and it will eventually regenerate the arm. In theory, if the arm doesn't get eaten, it could regenerate a whole nother starfish. But that's not reproduction, that's kind of accidental. So this is a weird group. Also, if you've ever seen, let me grab one. Starfish. Technically, when they're alive, there is a very, very thin skin over this. So technically, this is an endoskeleton. It's a skeleton inside because there's a skin over it. It's not over the skin, it's under the skin. But it's functionally an exoskeleton. Is that you scrape through the skin, you're gonna hit this. It's really hard to get at anything inside. And it's covered with spines. And the spines are pretty tough. There's the opening for the mouth. Here's where all the tube feet would have been. The digestive system is a tube digestive system, but there's a itty bitty hole right there. That's the exit. But basically the way they break stuff down, blobs don't really go through their digestive systems. That what comes out at the end is pretty liquefied. So you can get rid of it through a pretty small hole. This is a totally marine group. It only exists in oceans and seas. There are no freshwater echinoderms. They've not been able to make the transition into freshwater, which is weird because you do find them in tidal pools and you do find them in estuaries where fresh water from the land mixes with salt water from the oceans. But going to totally fresh water seems to have been not within their bag of potential tricks. Is that so you don't find them in fresh water. But there's a number of different groups. There's what are called sea lilies, also called feather stars. I'll come back to that. There's, I want to get the order right, starfish. Brittle stars, sea urchins, sand dollars, and sea cucumbers. Now obviously you can freeze this and write this stuff down because I'm going to move this to the side and show you a picture once I make the overhead here. Oh, it's over there. I wonder if you have mine. There is a group that has this, but it's on a stalk. So the shape of coral and hydra, it's thought that some of the most primitive of the echinoderms had that kind of support, something that grabs prey as it goes by kind of form. And that, like a snaky form, shows up in a bunch of different groups. Is that the stalk with tentacles, sort of, although these are not technically tentacles. Your typical starfish are fairly thick-armed, although there's a lot of variety, and it's not always 5, it could be 10, it could be 15, it could be 20. Crown of thorns, I think, has 55 arms. But it's pentaradial, it's a number that should be divisible by 5. Now, if you happen to find a particular echinoderm and it's got like 6, or it's got a number that isn't divisible by 5. It's just an unusual echinoderm. Sea urchins, a ball of spines. Sometimes the spines are coated with a toxin, so if you step on them, it's very, very bad news. They also are capable of moving the spines. They're browsers. They move across the bottom, and they've got these long tube feet that they kind of pick stuff up and put it in their mouths, and they walk along on their spines. And if you come and you kind of touch a spine, a bunch of spines will point over at you as a defense mechanism. And the spines are very odd, is that they don't grow from the bottom up, they grow from the top on. They actually crystallize. I read an article about it that described this weird way of building something that sticks out of your body. Instead of building it this way, it kind of builds it this way. But it's a weird group. Here's the bilateral larvae that very quickly becomes a pentaradial larva. Here's a sea cucumber. Fat wormy shape. There's wormy shape again. So there's a number of different groups within the echinoderms. They're very common all over the world. Find them in the surf zone. And that is the next to last group that we're doing. The next group is going to be ours. It's going to be split into a decent number of subgroups, but we're up to the last phylum.